Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today, getting started with the SharePoint Framework. So I see many familiar names on the list. I know that many of you have come and taken some of our SharePoint training at Critical Path before. You know, whether you took it back in 2007 when Farm Solutions, were the only game in town, or whether you've taken something with 2013 and 2016 working with SharePoint apps. That's great. So when we talk about the SharePoint framework, there's several different things that we're going to go through today. So we're going to start just with an overview of the SharePoint framework, talk about what it is. The development environment for the SharePoint framework is very different than many of us SharePoint developers have been working with before. So we're going to spend a little time talking about installing the tools and then just using the tools. So I'll do quite a few demos working with different projects. There's going to be a project template that we can use to create new projects. We're going to look at that, and I'm going to go through about 4 or 5 different samples. And then at the very end, we're going to talk about deploying. And what you're going to see is that we can deploy these things in the app catalog, just like we've been deploying SharePoint-hosted apps and provider-hosted apps. But there's some extra things that we need to do, and one of them is going to be taking our deployment files and pushing them out into an Azure CDN or Content Delivery Network. So there's quite a few things. Note that 2 people have asked, is there a build guide? We've created build guides in the past. We do not have a build guide yet. I would suspect over the next 2 months, Critical Path will have a build guide about how to build out a Windows machine. But of course, in this new world, do I give you a guide to build out a Windows machine or a Linux machine or a Macintosh? So I suspect we'd probably just do one for Windows, even though many of you are using different operating systems. Okay, now let's go ahead and start by just kind of talking about the evolution of the SharePoint platform for developers. So if we go back to 2001, well, pretty much customizing Camel was the only game in town. 2003, we could create .NET components that were web parts, but you had to basically do a lot of manual deployment. So I say it's really in SharePoint 2007 when they really formalized the development platform for Farm Solutions. And the idea is we build server-side DLLs. We'd be able to write C# code that programmed against the SharePoint object model. It ran right on the server. It had all kinds of features and XML definitions. And so now Microsoft has deemed these as very bad, very painful, because Microsoft can't move us over to SharePoint Online into the Microsoft Cloud if we start using these. Well, then the next thing was Sandbox Solutions, but they never really took off, so we won't talk about them at all. Well, then we had SharePoint apps that were renamed to iframes. So I'm guessing a lot of us spend some time in this world, or maybe you're still there, developing SharePoint add-ins. Now, quite often when we're working with a SharePoint add-in and I add something like a client-side web part, what really happens is they put an iframe on the page inside of SharePoint. And the reason for that is they want all the code that you add to your SharePoint app to go routing in through a different DNS domain. So basically they could, for all practical purposes, authenticate the app and put a security boundary around the app. So just because the user could do something doesn't mean your code can do something. Now, one of the problems with the SharePoint add-in model is then you have these 2 different domains. You have the app web, that's where your pages and your JavaScript code is served out of, and then you have basically the domain of the SharePoint site. And so you have to do all these really strange roundabout things, like call into one domain and make a web service call with a little flag that says, oh, by the way, I don't want to program against this site. I want to program against the site in a different domain. So while it did give us this layer of security, it just added in a lot of things that added, what a lot of us feel is unnecessary complexity. Now, another thing that's gotten to be quite popular over the last few years is JavaScript injection. And so it's based on this idea of we don't need those sneaking apps. We don't want to have these 2 different domains. We're just going to basically write some JavaScript code and put it right behind pages in a SharePoint site. Now, what's nice about that is all of a sudden your code just starts executing in the context and with the identity and permissions of the current user. So if I want to program against the SharePoint REST API or something like that, it's very easy to do. Two problems we have with JavaScript injection is, one, that it's possible, and quite often by default, this is the setting in SharePoint Online, is that the scripting capabilities of a site can be disabled, and then your JavaScript injections don't work. The second problem with JavaScript injection is that the SharePoint team really never sanctioned that as a official extensibility point for SharePoint, so they never created any type of formal deployment model. So most of us who use JavaScript injection simply write our own installer program with CSOM that basically copies a bunch of pages and .js files up to a SharePoint site. So what we'll see about the SharePoint framework is it really kind of takes the ideas of JavaScript injection and basically just starts wrapping a formal development platform around it. Okay. Now, the first thing that you need to do if you're going to get started with the SharePoint framework is basically go out and look at this one particular repository that's in GitHub. If I come up here and I click it, and then we go ahead and we route out here, what you're going to see is that there's docs down here, and there's all kinds of notes to set up your development machine. Another issue that we have here is that we're still in preview releases. When Microsoft releases a version 1 and then they release a version 2, they're quite respectful about not breaking things that you did with version 1. However, when you're in preview, a lot of things can change. And what you'll find is a lot of the sample code was built on one of these earlier builds, maybe in August 17th, September 1st, or September 14th. And then the files that they're putting are constantly changing. So what you might find is you have to update the pieces of code that they've created and pull them in. Okay, so things often break, and it's a certain world that some developers love to be in, and other developers just might not like it and might kind of want to wait till the preview period is over, before we get your hands dirty. Okay, I'm going to assume that everyone here likes to get their hands dirty and doesn't mind, having to, work through some grungy changeover details. Okay, now, when we look at the SharePoint framework, and we love this little acronym, SPFx, it's a development model based on this idea of pages that load in JavaScript components. Now, we're still going to have web parts in this model, and they're starting to call them client-side web parts. Okay, not to be confused with the client-side web parts from the SharePoint add-in model. Those are the things that live in iframes. These are not going to live in iframes. Now, what's nice is that your code is going to automatically run with the user's identity, and that user generally is already authenticated and already has things like browser connections to SharePoint and browser connections to Office 365 or Power BI. So it's going to provide a very easy way for us to get access, and quite often you're not going to have to go through the authentication step. You're just going to use this HTTP client and make calls, and authentication just basically happens transparently behind the scenes. Now, another thing that we're going to see is that Microsoft has created this set of tools, and what they've built on is not the classic Visual Studio development model. And the problem with the classic Visual Studio development model is, in the past, Visual Studio has just run on Windows, and so anything they would do, would be only for Windows-based developers. But there is this huge momentum in the industry of developer tools, mainly based on node.js and the Node Package Manager, that work across multiple platforms. They work on Windows machines, they work on Macintosh machines, they work on Linux machines, and there was a huge push in Microsoft, from the top down, to basically start doing more and more of their development based on these cross-platform tool chains. Okay, if you've never heard the term tool chain, you're going to start hearing it a lot. The idea is we have a lot of developer utilities, and sometimes you're going to use 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, maybe even 20 developer utilities, but everything stitched together is what we refer to as our tool chain. Okay, don't go pulling my tool chain. Okay, the other nice thing that we're going to see is that when we start going to these cross-platform development tools, they have great support for mobile devices. And as you look at the new user interface that's starting to crawl into SharePoint, one of the predominant themes is that they want to make it more mobile friendly. Now, here's the big picture. There's going to be a page in a SharePoint site. Sounds familiar. Kind of, we've been doing this type of development all along. But you're going to create a client-side web part that sits and basically gets loaded into a page. Now, what's nice about the SharePoint framework is I can choose JavaScript or TypeScript. I can basically choose any of the common JavaScript libraries. So let's say I like working with Knockout. I haven't gone to TypeScript yet, so I want to start using JavaScript, and I want to call to the SharePoint REST API. Hey, that's great. Okay, now let's say I create a second project. Now, this web part, I'm going to start using TypeScript. Now, if you haven't embraced TypeScript yet, the time is now. What you're going to find is more and more of these Microsoft frameworks aren't giving you the choice of whether you want to use JavaScript or TypeScript. They're all moving to TypeScript. I would say over the last 2 or 3 years, many of us have looked at TypeScript and say, hey, it's kind of optional. I could start programming TypeScript if I want to. But now, moving forward with things like the SharePoint framework, everything we have in Power BI, it just assumes everyone's using TypeScript, so all the developer tools are built on top of TypeScript. Now, once I start using TypeScript, I can use any library I want, whether it's D3, React, Knockout, Handlebars, and then I basically can write the code that calls off to different services, such as the Microsoft Graph API. Now, once again, when we start using the SharePoint framework, our code just lives right on the page, and you can access anything inside the DOM. So one thing that you can say is all the protection and the security boundaries that we got with the SharePoint add-in model, we've decided to throw those out the window and to basically go without them. So we have a much more straightforward model. We have no need to authenticate the user. We can basically touch any part of the page, but the price that we pay is now if I load in your web part, I really need to trust you and know that you're not going to do evil, malicious things, because you can basically do anything that the user can do. So your code's going to run with the identity and permissions of the current user. Now, when they've created this model, they've also used TypeScript to create things like base classes for our web parts. And so they have this formal lifecycle where our web parts will have things like the render method, the load method, serialize, deserialize, change configuration settings. So there's all kinds of events that you can tap into, and they've kind of already done the work of triggering these events and calling into your code. So basically, you just have to react to them. Now, what JavaScript framework do you want to use? React, Handlebars, Knockout, Angular 1, 2, D3. We're going to look at several of these in the different samples that we're going to be showing. Now, here's the common things that we're going to have in the toolchain. Things like the node.js platform. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. A package manager from Node.js, which is called Node Package Manager, or NPM. We're going to start programming in TypeScript. And then some of the other things that we're going to use are things like Yeoman, Webpack, Gulp, Git. Okay, now I can't explain all of these, but there's about 4 or 5 that as we go through the demos, we'll talk more about what they are. Now, a quick word on TypeScript. As I mentioned, if you want to continue programming with SharePoint or on the Microsoft platform, moving into the cloud, you can't keep ignoring the fact that TypeScript is a layer on top of JavaScript that just gives you a much more robust and type-safe way to write your code. So my point there is resistance is futile if you've been basically ignoring TypeScript all along. The other thing about it is, in theory, you could create a client-side web part for the SharePoint framework in JavaScript, but not using the tools that Microsoft is giving you. The tools all assume that you're going to be using TypeScript inside there. Now, when we start using TypeScript, we're going to start writing classes. We're going to write things in modules and interfaces. TypeScript gives us a lot of help with loading JavaScript modules, which is going to be very helpful. Okay, enough of talk. Let's get in and talk about things that we have to set up. Now, before that, I've already set things up. I'm going to go and pull up the Node.js command line. And with the Node.js command line, I'm going to go ahead and cd to my demos directory. Now, when we get in the demo directory, let's go ahead and I'll make a directory. So MD, and I'll just call this one hello. And so now we'll change over to this directory. And so what we're going to do is we're going to run this utility, which is called Yeoman or Yo. And there's going to be a template, and it's going to be Microsoft/SharePoint. And let's go ahead and run this right here. And one of the reasons I wanted to run this before the slide goes is that this is going to take several minutes to run. And so I want this at least to run one time. Most of my other samples are going to be pre-canned. But what you'll see is that what is the name of your solution? Hello, that sounds great. Which file or which folder to use? Use the current folder. What's the name of your web part? Let's just call that my web part. And what's the description? And we'll have something simple inside there. And now, what framework do you want to use? So they give you a choice of 3 right now with this tool. I'm going to choose no framework, and now it starts running inside there. Okay, let's go back to the slides. Now, when you start working in this world, everything is based on Node.js and a tool chain that derives from working with Node.js. Node.js is an environment that works across platforms, and one of its strengths is that if you have the files for a local website, it can basically act as a local web server, and so it can basically serve up your pages. Now, even when we don't need that server-side, web server infrastructure, when you install Node.js, it also installs something called the Node Package Manager. Now, to compare that to Visual Studio, if you create a Visual Studio project, quite often you're using the NuGet Package Manager to add in things like jQuery and D3 and Angular. Well, Node Package Manager at a high level is the same thing. It allows me to add different packages into my projects. Now, Visual Studio, until this new version 2017, is not as aware of this new environment. So Microsoft has something called Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code, think of it as a lightweight version of Visual Studio. It works across platforms, so you can install it on your Mac, and it's very savvy to work with Node.js and Node.js-derived tool chains. Okay, another thing that we're going to have to do is basically get a self-signed certificate along the way. We'll see how to do that. But basically you would go to this URL, you would download Node.js. As you start installing Node.js, notice down here that you're also getting in the default installation NPM or the Node Package Manager inside there. And then once you've installed it, you basically can start running the Node.js command line. Note that here I am running the Node.js command line. When you create one of these projects, it takes several minutes. Now, while I'm just using the Node.js command line, people actually have religious wars about what console they use. So while I'm just using, a very plain console application, if you install Git, there's Git Bash. There's another one called Commander. So you can use different consoles or different command line interfaces inside there, and it's kind of your choice which one you want to use. Next thing you're going to do is install Visual Studio Code. So you go to this URL. It's a very simple installation. It installs in minutes compared to Visual Studio, which is much larger, which was going to take you 20 or 30 minutes to install. Visual Studio Code can install in just 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, now when we work with NPM, you have a command line interface. And so if you call up the Node.js command line or any other command line that sees NPM in the path, we can start installing things. Now, when I look up here, you can see that npm install. If you put a /g, you're basically saying make that a global installation and not a project particular installation. So when we start using the window or the SharePoint Framework toolchain, you have to install the Windows build tools. You have to install another utility called Gulp. Gulp is going to be a very important part of this process because it's a task runner. After you install Gulp, you're going to install something called Yeoman. And once you install Node.js, you can go right to the console and just type these things in, and they'll install on your machine. Now, Yeoman, think of it as a templating engine so that anybody can create a template that defines the starting point of a project, and they can define these templates under the Yeoman format. Then they're able to upload their templates. So, for instance, after you install Yeoman, you're going to install the Microsoft-created template for basically creating new projects. And so at Microsoft Generator #SharePoint, you're going to do that. And once you've done that, you're going to be able to do the thing that I just showed you how to do. Okay, I look over here, and what you can see is that the project has now been installed. Okay, watch this trick right here. I want to open up a development utility or a development tool. So if I just type in code, that's how I can start up Visual Studio Code. And if I put a dot, code, space, dot, it basically says start up code and start it up at the current project right here. Okay, so now here is the starting point for one of these particular projects. So of course, there is a Package.json. So when you start using Node Package Manager, it wants to basically see this inside here, and it basically builds things inside. Okay, now there's some source code that we're going to have inside here. And under web parts, I can come back here, and I can basically see some things that were created at first. Okay, let's go a couple more slides. I want to create a new project. So you're going to basically run that yo at Microsoft/SharePoint. You know, what's kind of crazy about this is it takes a long time to basically build these. The people who built this template up here, you know, made some decisions about what goes inside of new projects. If I go back here and I kind of take a look at the different Node Package Manager modules that are added in, now you can see there are just tons and tons of these modules, and that each one has things like localized files. Okay, if I go back here, you know, let's go back to that new project that I just created. And I am going to right-click on it and look at properties. And one of the things that you're going to see is just the default project, you know, is basically over 200 megabytes in size. Okay. Now, once you've seen that, let's go ahead and kind of start working with the tool set here. Okay, so I basically showed you, you know, what the package.json file looks like. Now, you have this part of the tool chain, which is the Gulp utility. So Gulp is a task runner. And the idea is that people can write JavaScript code to define tasks that they want to have processed. And so the SharePoint Framework team that created this template have added lots of Gulp tasks inside there. So some of the things that they're going to be doing is taking your TypeScript code, and before we test our code, it's going to be able to compile or transpile that TypeScript code into JavaScript. Okay, there's also a CSS tool. So there's something which is called Sass, and we're going to see these different files that allow us to basically work with CSS in a more flexible way, and it's going to output CSS files. And then there's also tools that automatically take our JavaScript and CSS and bundle multiple files into a single file, and also that's going to minify the files. Now, there is this Gulp Trust Deb Cert. If you look at some of the first demos, if you go to that one site and you start seeing the SharePoint tutorial videos by Vesa, they're really great, but he did it before we had this nice thing right here, which is Gulp Trust Deb Cert. So if I go back here and I say Gulp and Trust, and once again, you know, this is just a name task, dev and cert, and we go ahead and enter. It's basically going to configure my project so it can be served up with HTTPS instead of HTTP. If you go back and you look at Vesa's intro tutorials, he always has to kind of do this trick where he tells the browser to ignore the fact that he's using HTTP. But now in a later build we got this, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to run that inside there. Okay, so now we basically configured our project to support HTTPS. Okay, and then the next thing we want to do, here's the big one, is you want to basically test your project. So what's nice about these projects is that without you having to do any work, Hello World already works. So when I choose Gulp serve, it basically goes through the process to take all my JavaScript or all my TypeScript and all my Sass code and basically compile it into JavaScript and CSS and package everything up. And then it basically starts up a local web server, serves it up, and then finally it's going to open up a browser, and basically in just a local file, it brings up something which is called the SharePoint Workbench. So the idea here is that now there's my web part. I can go ahead, hey, there's my web part, that's great. Now, what's kind of neat about this is, let's kind of put this page side by side. So we'll put the page over here. We'll put this over here. And now let's go and look at the code for 1 second. So I'm going to go down here to the code for the web part right here. And let's go ahead and make a simple change right here. And so with this particular simple change, I'm going to say something like hello world. And now I'm going to bring this down. I'm going to go ahead and save my work. And what happens is that they've hooked up these task runners to basically watch changes to your code. And once your code changes and you save the file, it automatically goes through the process of rebuilding and basically showing you what you have inside here. Okay, now you've seen that, let's go ahead and kind of look at a minimal project. Now, when you're running in the console and you're in test mode, I'm going to do Control-C. Control-C is basically one of the ways that you can stop the web server. So I want to stop testing the web part, move over to another one. Let's go ahead and kill this browser. And so what I want to do is, let's move over to another project. And so this particular project right here, and once again, I'm just going to do a gulp serve. And before I do gulp serve, we'll open up our development environment. And now we'll do a gulp serve inside there, which will basically start running our code. Okay, now, what I wanted to show you with this project is just the simplest type of project that we could have here. So when we're creating web parts, there is this API that we program against. Now, what you're going to see here is that inside of this particular project, if I go into things like the node packages, you're going to see at Microsoft, and there's just basically a lot of things inside here, including the SP web part base. And then one of the things about TypeScript, if you haven't used it, is basically how we load in the code from these other TypeScript files. And so in our case right here, we're going to say import, and then here is a particular TypeScript class that's defined for our base class inside here. And then basically here is the module we're pulling things out of. Now here, we're going to basically create a new hello web part class. We're going to inherit from base client side web part. Ignore this part, this little type inside there for now. But the main requirement of a web part is that it inherits from base client side web part, and it supplies a render method. All the other methods are optional inside there. Let's go back here. Let's go ahead and test our particular web part right here. So what we can see here is that, with this particular web part, I'm really doing nothing more than picking a style. I'll talk about styles in just a second, but we're creating a div, and we're putting the style name inside there, and we're saying hello SPFx. And if I basically came down here and we revised it and we hit save, we just have to wait a couple seconds, for that rebuild process to be able to go on and basically refresh my screen inside there. Okay, now back on the slides. I wanted just to give you a very simple hello world web part just to kind of show how we can reduce everything down to a minimal format when we get started. The other thing I wanted to show here was working with these special files which have a SPFx extension. So there is this tool which is called SAS for syntactically awesome style sheets. And the idea with these, let's go back here, and if I go back into source and we look for my web part and we see this CSS file inside there, what's nice about working with SAS is that unlike regular CSS, you can create a variable and use that variable to set a color or a font and then use that 20 different times. There's also support for nesting inside there. So let's say I go ahead and we change this over to pink, and I go ahead and hit save. And once again, what you're going to see is just like changing your source files inside there, changing that SCSS file is going to re-trigger the process to basically rebuild and test itself inside there. Okay, going just a little bit further, you have this workbench right here, which is the local workbench, and that's always going to be started up when you do a gulp.serve. Let me go over to another browser, and let me go over to a team site. Now, if you look at some of the tutorials about the SharePoint Framework, there's discussions of how you have to go and download workbench.aspx and put it in a SharePoint site. You don't have to do that anymore. So one of the things that they've recently done is that they've added the workspace into SharePoint Online. So if you go to a SharePoint Online site, and then after the site URL, _15 workbench.aspx, hey, you can serve that up inside here. And I look down here, and there is the hello SPX web part. Let's go ahead and add that inside there. Okay, this thing's running inside of SharePoint right now. Let's go back here, and maybe what I decided is that pink is not really my thing inside here, so let's go ahead, hit save, and once again it recompiles all the work that I've done inside there. And when it's all done, this one doesn't refresh automatically, but let's go ahead and refresh it here. And so what you can see is that I'm on a page live in SharePoint Online, yet all the web part code is being served out of a local web server that's been controlled by node.js. Pretty neat stuff inside here. The other thing on both the workbench up in SharePoint Online and the local workbench, is that I can start testing things. If I click on preview, here's what it's going to look like at runtime. Great. Let's go back to edit mode. What's it going to look like in my mobile device? So being able to quickly go back and kind of see what your code is going to look like in a small form factor for a phone, gets to be a very important aspect of doing development these days. Okay, so now that you have seen that inside there, let's keep going inside. And so the next thing that we're going to look at is basically working with other JavaScript libraries. So what you'll find is they add certain JavaScript libraries like React to projects when you create them. But let's say that you wanted a library that wasn't automatically added. So I'm going to show an example with D3, which allows us to basically use SVG graphics and create charts. Or if you wanted to use jQuery, well, you start by running the npm to install the actual library, D3, save that to my project. And then the other thing that you have to do is you have to install the type definition, or what we call the typings file. And the idea is that we have JavaScript libraries, so they can create a type definition file in TypeScript on top of that. And the idea is that when you're programming TypeScript and you program against the type definition file for D3 or for jQuery, you get IntelliSense, and you get basically type safety from compile time type checks inside there. Now, let's go ahead and look at this next example. Okay, so if I now shut this thing down, and let's now go back to this, and we'll go ahead and jump out of this project. You'll get pretty good with the command prompt inside here. Let's go over to charts. Let's go ahead and start this up. I'll go ahead and we'll look at the code, and at the same time we'll go ahead and start this one up. Now in our case right here, let's go ahead and take a look at this code inside here. So in our case right here, we're going to import D3. So once you have that type definition file, you basically are able to import it, and then we can get strongly typed programming against a JavaScript library, such as D3. Now D3 allows me to do things like have selections and create scales, create axes inside here. Let's go ahead and just, if I jump over to, well, still running right here. Give this another second to start back up again. Now, when this thing starts up, I'm going to be able to go down, see the bar chart inside here. Before I add that, one quick aside is you come back and notice that you have a bar webpart.ts file. So basically that's the main file that has your webpart definition. There is also a bar chart webpart.manifest.json file. So if I open that up, here I get to configure what the title of my web part is. They also have this Office Fabric icon font name. The default is Page. That's kind of boring. But you can use one of the other Office Fabric icon images inside there. So I'm using the one for Power BI. So note that when you drop this down, you get to define what graphic we're using. We'll go ahead, we'll add that inside there. So here's just an idea of, the kind of things that you can do with the D3 library. And I just kind of wanted to quickly show if you want to use some other JavaScript library, fairly easy to add that inside there. Okay. So let's keep going. Next thing that we are going to look at is web part context. So I've got a very simple example here. Let me do a little housework. Let me clean a couple of these things up right here. And now let's go ahead and open a folder. And so as we move over to this new style of development, it's not about projects. It's really about folders, or at least the folder defines the project, not anything else. So if I go ahead and open this example right here, what I wanted to show you is how once we create a class and we inherit from the base client-side web part, what gets to be really neat about that is that if I say this dot, there is a context object inside here. And once we get to the context, well, what type of context do you want? So there's page context. Now, in this example right here, I think just to save a little time, I'm not going to start up this example, but you can see here is that I have page context, and I can get to the site, the web, title. So the kind of things that you've been able to get to in the other SharePoint APIs that I'm sure you have programmed with in the past, you're able to get through, and these are basically just all served up to you as local contextual data. These aren't round trips to SharePoint. These are basically just pieces of data that are available to you very quick, very easy inside. And so you can kind of see the things inside there. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is working with web part properties. Now, I would say that what they've done here is pretty slick. So let me go ahead and close this down so I can take you through a code example. So in our case right here, we'll stop. We'll move back. Now we have one, and this one is the Walmart greeter. And so with the Walmart greeter, I thought it was a nice, happy thing to do. We'll go ahead and serve this one up. Now, the way things work is that you start by creating an interface. And that interface defines the properties that you want your web part to support. And ultimately where we're going is that we want these to be editable by the user. So the next thing that we do is we basically have a class, and notice that the interface with the properties, that is an interface that we pass as a generic type when we configure the base class client-side web part inside. And then you're going to have properties behind your web part. What's a little bit strange is it's not a class that implements it. It's an interface. But once you pass that interface, there's code that's able to determine, what properties we should have inside there. And then the next thing that you need to do is implement the property panel settings. Okay. Now, in our case right here, looks like we're still starting up inside here. It's going to take another second or so. But let's go back here. Oh, it looks like it's already up here. Let's go and look at our Walmart greeter. Now, the idea is that if I come over here and I go into property view, the SharePoint framework is basically getting rid of the old property panel that you're used to in SharePoint and replacing it with something that's far more reactive and much easier. Maybe I want to kind of change that. Welcome to Ted's house. You can kind of see that, as you're changing things are updating in real time there. I want to, be able to change things inside here. So the way that things work, let's walk through this, is you start by defining this interface. Okay, that's number one. Secondly, we basically have to create our web part and inherit from that interface. And now the properties are automatically going to be there. But now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to override property pane settings. So here we have pages, and I have greeter web part. And then I'm going to have two different groups, general properties and cosmetic properties. And once again, as you go down inside here, you're able to basically create the groups and then create the properties inside there. And so as I look at this one, I want a property pane text field. And here is the name of the underlying property that we're going to be bound to. Notice that up here, that in the render method, we're going to basically say, what are we rendering? This.property.greeting. And the idea is that anytime someone comes in here and makes a change, you're actually changing the property inside the web part, and that triggers a call to execute render a second time. Okay, now going down a little bit further, let's look at some of these other properties right here. So large font. Here, I'm going to have a property panel toggle, and it's going to be large font is the label, on or off. You can see kind of the results inside here. And so back up here, what I'm doing is I'm saying this.properties.large font. If that's true, let's go, with I might have this backwards. Okay, so obviously I should have the bigger font in front, not in back. Don't tell people of the bug in my code inside here, but you kind of get the idea that every time someone changes that, render fires, and we're able to kind of take the font size, and I've just basically showed you a little trick of embedding that inside there. Okay. Now that you've seen that, and maybe just the last one is property dropdown, and we're able to kind of change those inside. Okay. Now you've seen those, let's go back, and if I come back here and we go back, now I'm testing this thing inside of SharePoint again. If you go back and you try to refresh the page and it's not working, you might just close and reopen because it might need to pull things back up. But note that when you come into this page right here, one of the things that I want to show you is that you don't see the old classic property panel inside there. A little bit later, I'll kind of show you where that factors in. Because when we use our new style web parts in old style pages, there's going to be something where the old web part property panel is there with a little button you can click on to kind of get to this new property panel. But as the new UI takes over, this is going to be the UI that we're going to have inside there. Okay, a couple other things. Let's go ahead and look at the SharePoint REST API. So for this particular demo, let me go ahead and shut this down and come back here one more time. You can see you're going to be doing a lot of this type of stuff inside here. And so here I have a little demo that's going to show us how just to do a query against SharePoint to get back the lists in the current site. Okay, so this is going to be SP lists, and once again we'll open it up, and then we'll also go ahead and serve it up. Now here's one of these things where I want to call to SharePoint. If I was doing this in a real project, I would definitely structure my code differently. Basically putting the code that calls to SharePoint off in a custom service style class. But just to kind of put things into a single code file to step through is what I wanted to accomplish with this. Now here I have this method called getListData, and the idea is that it passes back a promise of ISP lists. Now up top here we have this interface. So for each list that I want to get back, I just want to track its title, its ID, and its default view URL. Now inside here, under the list viewer web part, under render, here I'm also doing a little jQuery work just to show you. If you like working with jQuery, that's fine. List viewer web part. Now look what we're doing here. If environment type equals local, if you're running in the local workbench, you've got no SharePoint context. You've got no ability to call into SharePoint. So if I'm coming up here and we look at the list viewer web part, you can't call into SharePoint. Okay, but now let's go back to the SharePoint workbench, which is up inside of a SharePoint site. Let's go ahead and go down. Let's find our web part inside there. There is the list viewer web part. And you can see that it's able to make calls across into SharePoint right here. If I go ahead and bring up our buddy Fiddler, and we run this page one more time right here, what we should be able to see right here is that if I go down and we look for that one particular call inside there, here it is. I can see the call going across, and what's really neat is there's the fed auth token. So a very important point here is that when it's time for you to call across the network, this .context HTTP client get, you didn't have to worry about figuring out what domain and whether you already had an established connection. And the idea is that on the SharePoint Framework team, they're trying to make more and more of our authentication transparent to us, as we're doing things inside there. Okay, a couple other demos I want to get to. One thing that you're going to see, and I wanted to call out, is that Microsoft and the SharePoint team are very big on this library, which is called React. Now, React is a library that is used very heavily in both Instagram and Facebook. So it's definitely a library that was made, for cloud-based environments. And the idea is that it just does the UI piece and the event handling inside there. Now, let me go ahead and show a quick example of working with React. So there is a project called FutureMan, and we'll go ahead and start that up. And then we'll also go ahead and serve it up so you can see what it looks like. Now, in our case right here, what I want to do is, first of all, show you that when we start working with React, they have something where in JavaScript it's called JSX, but the TypeScript version has a TSX extension. But the idea of working with React is that you're going to create components, and you get to write TypeScript or JavaScript that it really looks like they just have inline HTML inside there. Now, what happens is that there is this compiler that is going to take your JSX code, if you're working with JavaScript, or in our case, TSX code, and it has to basically transform it, into JavaScript code that emits the same DOM events inside here. Now, if I come back here and we take a look at this particular web part, let's look back here and just see a simple example. So here is something where I have a class name. I'm creating a particular button inside here. But inside of the button, when someone clicks on that, I want to create a on-click handler. And one of the things that's real big about working with React is this idea of state. So there is a set of properties and a set of state. The difference is that properties, once the app initializes, are immutable. You can't change those. But state we can change. And the idea is that you have a UI that is based on state. So you never go and change a text box value. You change the state. And the idea is that the UI reacts to the changes in state. So down here, we have inside the constructor, we're going to create in the state a variable, which is message. And the idea is that here, I can basically say div and state name equals message inside there. Yet someone's going to click on that button, and I'm going to say set state, and I'll set the message to something different. And basically, you can see that changed. Now, while this is a very, very simplistic demo of how React works, the idea that you can build a fairly complicated UI that has 10, 15 text boxes, all kinds of interaction, and you can make it so that it performs very, very well, that's one of React's strengths inside there. So I'm not sure I did justice to, what React, the JavaScript library is. But what you will see is that the SharePoint Framework team really likes React. It seems like they're even building out the property panel using React code. So it's just definitely one of the libraries that you should look to, as you start working with this inside here. Okay, let's go ahead and close this down. Now, seems like we got about 10 more minutes left. Just enough time to talk about deployment. Now, with deployment, what we're going to do is we're going to build packages. This sounds really familiar. Farm Solutions, you built packages. With the SharePoint app model, you build packages. With JavaScript injection, oh well, there was no packages. I had to do everything myself. But the idea is that they give us a file format to package things in. And what's great is the tool set that we're going to use does most of the work for us. So let's do this. Let's go back to one of my particular projects. And let's go back to the Walmart greeter, because he's got a couple properties and I want to show what they look like inside of SharePoint. Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll move over to the Walmart greeter. Let's also, inside the Walmart greeter, I'm going to open that up, take a look at what's inside there. Now we'll come back here and we'll say Gulp, and what we see on the slide is package solution. Okay, great. Let's go back here, and when I finally get back here, package and solution, we'll go ahead, we'll run that inside here. And so once this runs right here, what we should see here, as this guy runs right here, is that it's going to actually create a new directory, SharePoint solution, and there is a .sp.app file. Okay, so it's a different file format than SharePoint add-ins that have the .app extension, but watch how I deploy them. Let's go back into my SharePoint Online environment, and here is the app catalog. We're going to go to the app catalog and the apps for SharePoint. We're going to take this guy and we're going to drop them inside there. Once we drop these guys inside here, it's basically saying, do you trust this? Now, one shortcut that I took is I didn't push the files up anywhere that have to be downloaded. So I want to call out that now it says that they're being served up from my local machine. So really, to make this work, I'm going to have to come back here, and I'm going to have to fire things up from node.js. And so now node.js is going to be serving those particular files inside there. Okay, let's let this run for 1 second. And when this runs, it's basically just going to be serving up the files that we need. And here, it's a local workbench. I don't really care about the local workbench. Let's move that out of the way. And let's go ahead and say that's fine. Okay, now let's go to another site. And here's just another site in the same tenancy. So once you have basically pushed that SharePoint Framework deployment package into an app catalog, you're going to basically say add an app, and this is basically just going to be like we have a SharePoint add-in. There's the mark greeter solution. We'll go ahead, we'll choose OK. And it's basically telling me that everything I'm using is in preview. So if my company falls apart, don't blame Microsoft. Okay, and now that we've pushed that inside there, let's go ahead and use that. Okay, so now in this site, let's go back to our page. Inside of our page right here, we'll go to Edit Page. And so what Microsoft is trying to do, let's go back here to Insert and Insert Web Parts. And if I look at Custom, and where is that? Sometimes it takes a second before it shows up inside there. Okay, let me go ahead and refresh the page. Here's some other ones I've already deployed. However, I was hoping I can get these ones to show up inside there. Sometimes there's a small delay. There it is, the Walmart greeter. Let's go ahead and add that inside there. Okay, so now, there's the web part inside. And so now what I wanted you to see is when you take the new style web part and you deploy them in an old style page, let's go to Edit Web Part. So what you're going to see now is here's kind of the old thing inside there that I'm used to. But now if I go ahead and click on Configure, that takes me back to the new style of working inside there. Okay, we're almost all the way home, except now we need to actually deploy for real, because remember, if I go ahead and shut this thing down, so here are my local files. Let's go ahead and stop this. And now that I've stopped that, let's go ahead and try to refresh the page. It's going to choke because there's nothing that's serving up those files inside there anymore. It's trying to load, can't load. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. It all starts by going up to Azure, and Azure is what Microsoft is going to recommend, but generally you just need a place to push your files that are accessible over the internet. So arguably you don't have to push these inside of Azure. Now here I am in Azure, and so what I want to do is show you that I have created a storage account. And once I've created the storage account, you can also create a content delivery network. So I've created this content delivery network inside there. And then you add an endpoint. And the long and short of it is you need a place that you can push your files that are accessible over the internet. So basically we have this inside here. Now, once you've got that, the next thing that we can do is, let's go back. And I've already deployed one of these. So I'm going to say Open Folder. And we're going to go look at our charts inside here. And so what you'll notice is that if you go down to Config, there is something which is Deploy Azure Storage. And so here, notice that you can put your Azure account. You can put a key in place right here. And then also, within an Azure storage account, you can create containers. So I've created a container named chart. Now, once you've done that, what you're going to do is go through this process. Let me go to the next page right here, where you're going to say Gulp ship and Gulp deploy Azure storage. Now, if I go back here, let's go ahead and do those two. So there is Gulp and ship, and there's two hyphens inside there. So basically this is going to prepare things so that when I run the next command, deploy to Azure storage, things are going to be pushed inside there properly. And so that's our first step. The next step is deploy Azure storage. So we'll come back here and say Gulp and deploy Azure storage. So things that I had to work out in advance, I do have to spell storage correctly, is that I had to basically create a storage account, create a CDN. Arguably the CDN is something you don't have to use. I'm in the wrong project. Give me one more second here to switch over to charts and run those two things once again. And what you're going to see is that after I run these, that the Gulp task, has basically done the work of copying these things into my storage account, which makes them available through the CDN inside there. Okay, I want to get you to the other side here so we can see this. Give it one more second. Okay, so when you say Gulp ship, it prepares the files that it's going to ship. And so after running this Gulp ship, let's go back to our project. Let's go ahead into charts. And what you're going to see here is that they have a deploy. And so basically those are the two files they just created. Okay, so now the next thing that we do is we run this Gulp deploy Azure storage. And so this is going to take those two files and it's going to push them up into the Azure cloud. Now, if I go ahead and step through here, and now here's a little tool called the Cloudberry Explorer that I use. But notice that if I go up to that particular account and I look at charts, I basically just push these two different files, one a JS file and one a JSON file. And those are the only two files that get deployed. And all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript I did live in this one particular bundle file. Open it up and look at it. It's got a lot of stuff inside there. Okay, now that you've done that, two more things that you do is you basically say Gulp bundle ship, and then you're going to have to go back here. You have a write manifest, and so here you basically put a path to where those files are going to live. And then you're going to run these last two commands. So this is going to bundle up stuff that has the CDN URL, not the local URL. And then you're going to say Gulp package solution. And so once you've done that, let's go ahead and see how things are going to work. Now let's go back to the app catalog. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take that file and dump it inside here, just like the other one, except now this SPS app file doesn't point to localhost 4321. It points to those files that are up there in the Azure CDN. Okay, once we've added those inside there, let's go ahead and go back to a SharePoint team site that we have. And inside of our SharePoint team site, the first step would be to add an app. And I have already added this app. I basically added it beforehand. Just to make sure. No, actually, I didn't add it in yet. So let me go ahead and add an app. And now we'll go back here. No, I think I did already add it in. Sorry about that. Let's go back here to contents. And as I look down here, where is my particular chart? Okay, it's down here. Okay, so now that we have that inside there, let's go ahead, go back to our home page right here. And so the idea is that someone adds that SharePoint Framework package up into the app catalog. Someone then activates it just like you would activate an app inside of my team site. And once we've done that, we're going to go back into Edit Page. Now I'm going to go back to Insert and Insert Web Part. We're going to go and we're going to find our web part inside there, and we're going to go ahead and add it in. And so basically now we've kind of seen the big picture, of how we push things out there. So ultimately, we have a .js file and a .json file that define our entire project, one or more client-side web parts. We push them to the CDN, and then we have a little packaging mechanism that just basically tells SharePoint where those things are. And instead of trusting packages, it seems like going forward, you'll be trusting some type of a URL that points to a CDN. And if it has, if it's a CDN that we trust, we'll basically allow the code to run in. But once again, the key point here is your code runs without any restrictions other than the permissions of the current user. So your code can basically do all kinds of things that you want it to do. Okay, so that takes us to the end. I've got a bunch of questions there queued up. I'm going to go ahead and work through that. One thing to note is that at Critical Path Training, probably the course that would be most applicable to the people that came today would be our cloud-based development with Azure and Office 365. So here's a course that preps you for the Azure Development Certification exam. It uses best practices like MVC and Angular. It does a lot of work with Azure storage, but it also hits things like a little bit on SharePoint add-ins, SharePoint Framework code, doing things like authentication with Azure Active Directory. Okay, so once again, if you're looking for training in 2017, it might be worth your while. Okay, so with that, I'm now just going to spend a little bit of time, since we're kind of a little bit past the hour, going through some of the questions that people have right here. Now, also, I have not uploaded the slides or the code for this. So the follow-up email that all people who registered for this event are going to get will have a link where you can download the things that I showed you today. Okay. So, question from Salam, are all those projects created by Yo and the Microsoft/SharePoint template? And yes, every single project I have was created by those. Note that some of the samples were created with releases before release 6. So if you pull those down and you try to run them and they don't work, there is a way that you can basically take the Yeoman generator and pull the very last Microsoft project template files into your project. But that's something that, to get some of the projects, you might have to work with those. Did you get the workbench in Office 365 and SharePoint Online, or did you have to upload it? So currently, there's a better story, and that story is that you do not have to upload the workbench like we had to a couple months ago. So in fact, you could just go to any SharePoint Online site now, and if you then go to _layouts 15 workbench, you'll basically get the workbench that's just built into SharePoint. So once again, there's no need to go down and actually upload a workbench.spx file like we had to back in August. Okay. Any clue to the time frame of coming out of beta? No, I don't have any information about those. Sorry about that. Okay, please share your GitHub URL. So what I will do this afternoon is basically just make my samples available in a GitHub repository, and the follow-up email message will have that. It will also have a link to the recording of this as well. Okay, where are the actual web part properties stored? Are they part of the page or using a JSON object? They're definitely stored using JSON inside there. If I go back to one of these particular web parts, for instance, let's say we go back and we take a look at this Walmart greeter inside here. So here, we have defined some properties for our web part, and if we look at the manifest for that web part, which is JSON, has a property section, so there's where you can put, excuse me, all your initial values for your web parts inside there. Okay. Let me just take one or two more of these pages inside here. Our questions? Okay. See, most of these things are just asking about the available URLs. So actually at this point, I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and conclude this. Let me thank everyone for coming, listening about the SharePoint framework. Some of the other people out there, between Vesa at Microsoft and Scott Hillier, Andrew Connell, there's a lot of great content and blogs that are going on. Waldeck is another one of my favorites. Chris O'Brien. So there's a lot of blogs where you're getting a lot of good information. Because we're in the preview phase, sometimes the blogs from 3 months ago have things that don't work anymore, but that's part of the fun. But look for a follow-up email. If you have a need for training in 2007, please look to see what we have at Critical Path Training. And once again, I thank everybody for attending and being part of this webinar. Thanks again.